Everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, delighted to be talking with artist, comics creator Paul Rivoche. Paul, thank you for jumping in, joining, and what a comfortable space you appear to be in.
Yeah, I'm over here in Toronto, so I work out of my living room. And
Love
thanks
it.
for inviting me, Jason.
A pleasure. Thanks for saying yes. Folks out there, I know you best, I suppose, as a person that has done a great number of covers, especially Iron Man and Armor Wars, but you've worked on a lot of different characters. You have some longer works like The Forgotten Man and some Isaac Asimov adaptation work out there, a book called Derek from Isaac Asimov. Any other notable works for listeners that you'd like to mention?
I guess that currently, I've been a kind of jack of all trades in my career. So I've worked in comic books, illustration, and a lot of work in animation doing background design. So I guess the most notable recent thing is I was the lead background designer for an Oscar-nominated film, Robot Dreams, that's now in release in the US. So
Yeah.
I kind of have been wearing different hats because, in the comic book field, it's can be somewhat darker material,
Mhm.
whereas something like Robot Dreams is quite cartoony and lighter. So I've made it, my goal to be versatile, and it's really about survival, being a freelancer, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now I have to tell you, I've facilitated school visits with Sarah Varon, the author of Robot Dreams. I've
Oh,
done some
good.
written interviews, and I've taught that book. I've taught it as a book form. So I saw Robot Dreams on your website. I was curious about the connection. So awesome, awesome things.
Yeah, I mean, and so we could delve into either that or you had mentioned the Robot City.
Hmm.
That's for the science fiction fans. So that
Yeah.
was like a series of book covers I did in the 1980s. And I was commissioned by Byron Price Visual Publications. And so he had made a deal with Isaac Asimov to kind of revivify, the series of novels that he had done based on robotics and whatever. I think it was the five laws of robotics, I forget. But so he
Hmm.
dreamed up this package or this concept, and then he pulled in different artists and people to do the covers and to write the books and all that. So it was a kind of a long-term thing. I was quite heavily involved in it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious about your sort of your origin story as an artist. What connected you with visualizing and creating in different forms?
Well, that's kind of I'm trying to think of the TLDR version of that. The story I tell is from the earliest point, because you go through a series of progressions, right? The earliest memory I have of discovering drawing is I tell the story of being in the YMCA in Montreal. I was probably about 5 or 6 after a swimming class, maybe 7, I can't remember. But another little boy challenged me to a drawing contest to draw Superman.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, I had to admit to myself after it was over that I had lost quite badly. But somehow that spurred me into drawing more. And then I was discovering comic books back then. And it just kind of accumulated like a rolling snowball thing. It's like you
Hmm.
discover that you have an aptitude for something and an interest, which further pulls you into it. And by the time I was a teenager, which was in the 1970s, it was the era of lots of different kinds of comics. So I was reading everything from Jack Kirby comics to British comics to things like creepy and eerie. I was consuming all sorts of paperback books, science fiction books, reading Analog magazine in the school library. I was just completely going wild with all this stuff. And then began dawning on me you could make a career of this because I was getting better at it and trying to get to a point where I had enough craft and knowledge that I could conceivably become a professional artist. And there were several more steps after that. I don't know how extensive a story I should tell you, but I moved to Toronto, and then I eventually got in. I got my foothold by getting a background designer job at Nelvana Animation, and they were doing back then. This would be in 1980. They
Hmm.
were doing this feature film, Rock and Rule, which was their foray into doing a first feature film. And they had been doing TV specials, So I was lucky enough at the age of 20 to get this job designing backgrounds. And it was kind of like a fast learning thing. And it eventually, to my surprise, became what's considered a cult classic, Rock and Roll, an early Canadian animated feature film. We were competing with, if you remember, Heavy Metal did a film back then in
Hmm.
the 80s. So
Hmm.
we are kind of like neck and neck competing because we knew they were in production too.
Nice, nice. Love the history of creating. And I talked with Mike Cavallero and a couple of people that have worked in comics and animation. Do you find that one kind of feeds into the other, that the practice kind of builds from space to space?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a core of inspirational artists behind both, but of course they're two separate things. It's like a Venn diagram. There's a certain overlap. I mean, they have storytelling in common. Of course, animation is in real time, so
Hmm.
you have to consider all that, things like timing, whereas comics, the timing is in the panels. And like Will Eisner brilliantly explained in his books, the arrangement of panels and the way you distribute them, the size, and so on, that's your time in comics. So, there's storytelling and story at the root beneath both of them. It's just that how you manifest them in each one is a little bit different. But for me back then, like I had started getting into this because I loved story.
Hmm.
And I had visually, like many people, envisaged a simple idea of, oh, I'll, move to Toronto and somehow get into doing comic books professionally. Well, I mean, this is the early 80s. There was barely any scene of comics, but there was of animation that was brewing. Comics were all in New York City, basically, right? Where DC and Marvel were. But I was so uneducated about it that I hadn't really realized that. So it turned out that for me, working in animation was more practical. And I eventually got into doing comics. But again, I kind of zigzag back and forth between them.
Hmm.
Sometimes from what I preferred, but other times just as a matter of you become a working professional, you need to keep the shark moving right through the water. You cannot afford to go dead. So it was always a matter of finding the next job.
Yeah, yeah. Well, curious also about the approach that you take when you're creating a visual world, if it's Robot Dreams or Isaac Asimov or whatever it happens to be. What are some of those parts of your process and the things that you're thinking about?
Sure. I mean, well, you're first thinking about the nature of the project. So those are, of course, as you would know, very different in their nature, like science fiction, Isaac Asimov robots. It's kind of the sky's the limit. And that's enjoyable. You can just invent stuff.
Hmm.
And within the boundaries of once you get stuff established, you're trying to make it consistent. Like when I did the book covers for Robot City for Isaac Asimov, they wanted a certain style, and I established this kind of vaguely Art Deco stylized airbrush style. We had a logo that I worked on, and once that was rolling, I had to stay consistent. But within that, I was doing drawings for the interior. So within that, you could just really improvise. And there were various robots and settings that they asked me to draw. Now, something like the animated feature movie Robot Dreams was quite a bit different in terms of how I'd go about it because I was commissioned as a North American, like it was done in Spain. And being Europeans, they wanted not only a proficient background designer, but somebody who was from North America. So
Hmm.
Canada's close enough to understand the settings of the movie, it is set in 1980s New York City. So that was a different task in that, unlike science fiction where you can sort of freewheel, we had to really intensively research what New York City looked like in 1980, and then kind of put it through the cartoon filter, if you will, to make it look believable and within the sort of cartoon paradigm of the backgrounds, which in this case, they had fairly cartoon characters in the foreground, and their
Hmm.
backgrounds I drew were somewhat more realistic in terms of they weren't zany like if you think of Chuck Jones cartoons for Warner Brothers, where they
Hmm.
have kind of wonky angles and stuff. It wasn't like that. That we had decided to do realistic perspective and make it more sober, perhaps somewhat in the vein of the classic Disney movies, which is what you see there. That in a lot of them they have fairly realistic backgrounds, and in the foreground, fairly cartoony characters. And really, in a lot of Japanese anime and similar productions, you have a similar effect, right? They have very
Hmm.
detailed and realistically lit backgrounds. And then in the foreground, you have more stylized characters. And it's an interesting combination. So um, that's really my way of saying that each job you kind of approach a little bit differently. And being
Yeah.
versatile, I was able to adjust. And you're trying to, you're trying to key in with what the story and the script wanted. In the case of Robot Dreams, it's a fairly it's kind of got a bittersweet thing to it because
Hmm.
it explores the relationship of a lonely dog in 1980s, this animal world of 1980s New York City, where he sees a 1-800 commercial. Are you lonely? Buy this robot. So he orders the robot. It's really quite well done,
Hmm.
and then they go on to have these different relationships. It becomes kind of a sort of almost a dual level thing that a little kid could watch this movie and get a lot out of it. But there's a whole deeper layer that an adult will perceive. It's really a commentary on friendship and relationships and the course of life, right? Twists
Hmm.
and turns of life. So, anyway, I guess I got a little bit away from what you were asking, but
No, that's
each
great.
job
That's
is
great.
different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of your versatility, how did comic book covers become part of this? Was that a natural step from working on book covers in other areas of publishing?
I think so. I'm trying to remember how I got my first comic book covers, which were, in the earlier 80s, I did a smattering of ones for smaller publishers. And, I guess as I accumulated what you'd call professional credentials and a track record in animation, at some point I made some contact with DC Comics and began being commissioned to do very smaller things. Like I never did really a long-term series for them,
Mm-hmm.
but I did a number of short stories and I did a bunch of covers, for example, Superman covers, and later got in contact with Marvel Comics and did Iron Man covers. So I can't actually answer the exact sort of genesis of how that happened with the DC Comics, but it may be through the connection of animation because Warner Brothers is connected to DC Comics, and I was doing animation storyboards and background designs in that period very intensively for Batman Beyond, the TV
Hmm.
series of the Batman animated series, Superman, Justice League, Legion of Superheroes, all the DC sort of animated products.
Yeah,
It may
yeah.
have been through that bridge I kind of got into doing comics, but honestly, I can't at this moment remember. It's been a while.
Funny enough, yeah, yet another connection. I just finished rewatching the Batman Beyond series, just sort of
Oh,
watching back through. So great work there as well. Just you mentioned Art Deco a little while ago, and
yeah.
establishing a visual world like that that's very different from those series that you mentioned, from Batman the Animated Series to Batman Beyond to Superman.
Yeah, I mean, in Batman Beyond, they kind of carried on from the earlier Batman animated, and that was kind of a stylized Art Deco sort of background. Like the needs of animation were such that you wanted to have a simplified background style.
Hmm.
They had even said that they had been partially inspired by work I did in this comic book series, Mr. X, back in the 1980s, where I'd
I've
done
seen
Art
that.
Deco
Yeah.
posters.
Uh-huh.
So people like Bruce Timm, and I think the man's name is Eric Radomski. I don't think I met him. They had taken some inspiration from that and other sources, done Batman animated, but then when it became time to do Batman Beyond, I think it was kind of like an extension where we had to turn it into a science fiction version of that style. So it's like a futuristic, what do you call it, neo-Gothic noir science. I forget, they had a
Hmm.
name for it,
Hmm.
where it's
Yeah.
like a neo-Tokyo, it's futuristic. They were bringing in influences from anime, Japanese anime in the background. And I guess I just continued on working for them, and they knew that I could give them what they needed. So I had a whole long history with them, working remotely from here in Toronto, doing every week doing 4 or 5 background designs. In the pre-digital age, I would render them up with markers and gray tones. And fortunately, I saved scans of them all. But I remember boxing up a FedEx box every Friday, and running
Yeah.
in my vehicle to the FedEx depot before the deadline. And then of course the digital age arrived and it became a whole bunch easier. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's been a while since I did those, but it's good. It seems fascinating that you happened just by coincidence to rewatch them.
Yeah, yeah, just it's just one of those symmetry moments. And I've heard that comics creators and animators in the 80s and 90s had great relationships with the FedEx office. That's what I've heard.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it was just another time because I remember some really hectic, stressful times though, frankly, because you'd be working on something and then you had to gauge in like in my case, I needed like half an hour with the traffic to get to the place before the door shut, and you're just like stressed. But of course,
Hmm.
all that went away once you had digital delivery because whereas you still had deadlines, of course, it wasn't quite that tight. So yeah, those I don't miss that aspect of it. What I did eventually find that I missed, which may be of interest, and I'm now fixing, is that of course, and this is a whole nother topic area, the whole thing of doing art digitally is very seductive, and
Hmm.
so it really drifted away through the years with the ease of Photoshop from doing physical art on real paper with markers, pens, brushes, whatever, and more recently, in my current version of my career, I've been getting back to doing like art commissions and working on real paper. And at
Nice.
first, I kind of had to push myself because you get a little bit rusty, right? Like it's a whole different, in what they call, ironically, the meat world. It's
Hmm.
a very different workflow. It has a lot of commonalities, but also a lot of different things. Mainly, there's no undo button.
Hmm.
So you have
Hmm.
to have that, you have to go back to that craft discipline. Like I've got a marker, putting a line down. It has to be the one I want as close as possible. I do have the option of whiting it out or hatching it or something, but you don't prefer that. So
Yeah.
there's a real level of discipline, that I learned earlier, and then you get into the seduction of Photoshop and layers and undo and all these gimmicks and things, which are not all bad. I'm not a hater on that world, but
Hmm.
I kind of on balance, I'm glad I'm going back now to. I use digital mainly at the tail end of my process. It's a catch-all where you can fix things.
Hmm.
Like if you made a head too big and you did it in the original art, and you look at it a day or two later and you do a take and you go, wow, that's wrong. Now you
Hmm.
can easily fix it. Whereas before I would have had to, if I had time, photocopy it, reduce it down, and paste it over, things like that, or redraw it. But so it's a different world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know that many times there are projects that people can't talk about, and I imagine that's often the case if you're working on an animated feature or something like that. But anything that you'd like to share about the kind of creative steps you want to take next?
Sure. Right now I'm exploring being part of the independent comics space on X, that are people who are just freely creating their comics using crowdfunding. That's
Hmm.
kind of my next target. So, like many people, for a long time, I've had many projects and ideas I've doodled, and some of them more focused than others. But, as compared to, for example, the era I was talking about, the 1980s, compared to now, it's so radically different. I mean, graphic novels are widely accepted, they're everywhere. Comics are not frowned upon. There's
Hmm.
digital delivery, worldwide exposure. So it's a very encouraging time for that. So with that in mind, I'm working finally on selecting a project to kind of aim towards crowdfunding. And that's in the slightly longer term, like next few months type thing. In the short term, I've been also developing my commissions business, as I mentioned, which is people commission me to do different kinds of drawings, whether it be their own character or, draw me Batman Beyond or things like
Hmm.
that. So I'm on X under Rocket Fiction. I also have a YouTube channel of the same name, Rocket Fiction, one word. And I've been doing, I think I'm about up to 70 videos. I've been recording various drawing tutorials mostly, which, you got to go with, what did they say, Jason? Write about what you know. So
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
similar in the YouTube or streaming world is talk about what you know. And, I'm not a political commentator or something like that. I have all my opinions like everybody, but it's not something I would center my persona around online. So it's really, I realize I've always been good at and studied myself drawing techniques, craft, and I've been good at explaining it. And I think there's a need for that too. So that's kind of where I'm focused uh, in parallel with, as I said, doing commissions and developing comic projects. So
Fantastic, fantastic. I also mentioned the website. So, spaces where people can go to see some of your work. I suppose that would be one of those.
yes,
Any
lots of
particular method that you prefer as far as commissions?
Probably the best one is through X. If you message me on X for people that use that, I'm also under on Instagram under,
Mhm.
and it's all under Rocket Fiction. Like the website is www.rocketfiction.com. So it's easy to find me. And either on Instagram, you could message me, or on X. That's probably the simplest. And then I get back to people with info. And we can talk about what they'd like, because some people want a very small drawing and other people want something elaborate. So it's custom tailoring.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, Paul, I appreciate the conversation. Have we missed anything that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
No, I'd say, just the usual exhortations about please follow me if you like my content, because it does make a difference to people. I've been building my YouTube channel and that's been really good. I hope to do actually streaming as soon as I can. But it's kind of a thing, as you would know, Jason, like you have to build it up to the point where it's justified
Mhm.
and you can get monetized and sort of move on there, because it's this brave new world of surviving as a creative artist or writer, I'm sure, or whatever your creative thing is. And so I guess I would mention that any like, comment, share, subscribes you can do if you like the content. That really helps me. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you once more. Glad to have you back anytime as you're working on projects and particularly as you're breaking into the creator-owned spaces. Please consider this a space to come back to if you want to talk about any of those.
Oh, I appreciate that. I'll certainly do that. It's been enjoyable, and thanks for listening and asking.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. Thank you.